They called it a shooting gallery. In early 1942, German U-boat crews believed the Atlantic belonged to them, and America's Navy was nothing more than a target waiting to burn. What followed would begin as mockery and end in a graveyard beneath black waves. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, Admiral Karl Dönitz saw opportunity, not danger. To him, America was industrially powerful, but militarily naive. Its navy, he believed, lacked experience in anti-submarine warfare. Its coastline was sprawling and poorly defended. Its merchant ships sailed in bright silhouette against glowing cities that refused to dim their lights. For seasoned U-boat commanders hardened by years of Atlantic warfare against Britain, this was not a challenge, it was a feast. Dönitz launched Operation Drumbeat in January 1942. The German name was Paukenschlag, a drum roll announcing destruction. Type X U-boats crossed the Atlantic and slipped into American coastal waters with astonishing ease. Kapitanleutnants peered through periscopes and could scarcely believe what they saw. Oil tankers steamed independently without convoy escort. Cargo ships zigzagged alone, unaware they were being watched. At night, the skyline of cities like Miami and New York illuminated the sea behind them, turning merchant vessels into perfect silhouettes. The first torpedoes struck like thunderclaps. Flames towered into the sky as tankers ruptured and burned, oil spreading across the water in sheets of fire. Survivors clung to debris, while lifeboats drifted toward shorelines that could see the glow but not stop it. U-boat crews watched through binoculars as chaos unfolded. In their war diaries, some described the American response as amateurish. They joked about coastal patrols that never appeared and destroyers that arrived hours too late. The Atlantic, once a deadly chessboard against the British, now felt like open hunting ground. Between January and June 1942, hundreds of ships were sunk off the American coast. German submariners called it the Second Happy Time. They surfaced boldly at night to recharge batteries, confident no aircraft would find them. Torpedoes were conserved carefully, but sometimes even deck guns were used against defenseless freighters. The United States Navy had ships, yes, but not enough escorts, not enough trained anti-submarine crews, and not yet the coordinated system of convoys that had saved Britain during its darkest hour. Dönitz believed this campaign would strangle America before its industrial machine could fully awaken. Every tanker sunk meant less fuel for Britain. Every freighter destroyed meant fewer supplies crossing the Atlantic. He calculated tonnage obsessively. If German submarines could sink merchant ships faster than the Allies could build them, victory might still be forced through attrition. It was mathematics beneath the waves. Yet beneath the apparent triumph, subtle changes were already beginning. American shipyards, once peacetime facilities, were transforming into engines of relentless production. While U-boats celebrated nightly successes, welders and engineers worked under floodlights along the East Coast and Gulf of Mexico. The United States Maritime Commission accelerated construction of Liberty ships, simple, rugged cargo vessels designed for mass production. Unlike the elegant liners of the pre-war era, these ships were utilitarian and blunt, built to be assembled quickly rather than admired. Still, in early 1942, U-boat commanders felt untouchable. They tracked convoys bound for the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, where oil refineries and shipping lanes converged. Tankers exploded in harbors. Coastal communities watched the war unfold from beaches and boardwalks. The psychological effect was profound. Americans had believed oceans were shields. Now the enemy was offshore, invisible and lethal. German confidence hardened into doctrine. Wolfpack tactics refined against Britain allowed submarines to coordinate attacks by radio.
When one boat sighted a convoy, it shadowed the formation and transmitted its position. Others converged silently, forming a ring around the prey. At night, they attacked on the surface, low silhouettes slicing through black water, torpedoes firing in synchronized waves. Escorts struggled to respond, their sonar primitive and their coordination limited. Depth charges detonated blindly, columns of water where submarines had been moments before. Often the U-boats slipped away untouched. But technology does not stand still in war. By mid-1942, American commanders were studying British convoy systems closely. Coastal blackouts were enforced, denying submarines the illuminated backdrops they had exploited. Merchant ships were reorganized into escorted formations. Destroyers and corvettes began patrolling with increasing discipline. Aircraft extended their range with new paddle patterns. The vastness of the Atlantic remained daunting, but gaps slowly narrowed. The true turning point, however, was not visible in a single battle. It was systemic. American industry was accelerating at a pace Germany had not imagined possible. Shipyards that once built a handful of vessels per year were now launching hulls every week. Prefabrication techniques reduced construction time dramatically. Sections were welded together like components on an assembly line. When a U-boat sank a freighter, another seemed to appear in its place. Submariners began noticing subtle differences. Convoys were larger, escorts were more aggressive. Radar sets appeared on ships and aircraft, detecting surfaced submarines at night. What once was safe darkness became exposure. Searchlights snapped on without warning. Bombs fell from patrol planes that seemed to materialize from nowhere. Depth charge patterns grew more accurate, bracketing submarines in suffocating explosions. In March 1943, the tide truly shifted. Allied escort carriers, small aircraft carriers dedicated to convoy protection, extended air cover into the mid-Atlantic gap where U-boats had once roamed freely. Long-range bombers hunted relentlessly. High-frequency direction finding tracked German radio transmissions, allowing convoys to avoid wolfpacks or ambush them preemptively. Losses mounted. Boats that failed to return became statistics in Dönitz's reports. Crews who had once toasted easy victories now faced longer patrols and fewer successes. The Atlantic was no longer a shooting gallery. It was contested water. Submarines were forced to remain submerged for extended periods, draining batteries and limiting speed. Surfacing to recharge risked radar detection. The hunter's freedom was shrinking. German sailors felt the change in their bones. Depth charge attacks grew more sustained, more precise. The ocean itself seemed hostile, churning with explosions. Inside pressure hulls, lights flickered and bolts strained. Men waited in silence as hulls creaked under crushing pressure. Survival was no longer routine. It was uncertain. Admiral Dönitz understood the implications. The arithmetic he had trusted was reversing. Allied ship production outpaced sinkings. New technologies were eroding the submarine's stealth advantage. The Atlantic campaign, once Germany's most promising path to victory, was becoming a battle of endurance it could not win. Yet even as the tide turned, U-boat crews continued to sail. Orders were orders. Pride and duty compelled them into waters increasingly patrolled by aircraft and bristling with escorts. The Atlantic was vast, but it was no longer empty. It was filling with steel, destroyers, carriers, merchant hulls, an industrial armada advancing inexorably eastward.
By the spring of 1943, the Atlantic no longer felt like open water. It felt like a trap slowly closing. German U-boat commanders who had once mocked America's weak navy now sensed something far more dangerous than enemy ships. They sensed coordination. The sea lanes were no longer chaotic and vulnerable. They were organized, shielded, and watched. And the watchers were multiplying.
Admiral Karl Dönitz had built his strategy on numbers: sink more tonnage than the Allies could replace, starve Britain, delay America, force negotiation. But by early 1943, those numbers were betraying him. American shipyards were launching Liberty ships at astonishing speed. What once took months now took weeks. Entire cargo vessels slid into the water almost faster than U-boats could reload torpedoes. Germany was fighting a nation whose factories did not sleep. The Atlantic convoys themselves had transformed. Instead of scattered merchantmen sailing independently, ships now traveled in tight formations, surrounded by rings of escorts. Destroyers, corvettes, and newly deployed frigates worked in disciplined patterns, their sonar pings slicing through the water. Radar sets swept the horizon. High-frequency direction-finding stations triangulated German transmissions, locating wolfpacks before they could fully assemble. The invisible advantage submarines once held was eroding. One of the most devastating changes came from the sky. Escort carriers, small utilitarian vessels, extended Allied air cover deep into the mid-Atlantic gap. Where once U-boats could surface freely beyond the reach of land-based aircraft, they now risked sudden attack at any hour. Patrol planes armed with depth charges and rockets scoured the sea. The moment a periscope broke the surface or a conning tower appeared to recharge batteries, aircraft descended with lethal precision. Inside U-boats, life became suffocating. Crews were forced to remain submerged longer, conserving air and battery power. Carbon dioxide levels rose. Condensation dripped from steel walls. The smell of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies lingered in confined compartments. Every sonar ping from an escort felt like a hammer striking the hull. Every explosion of a depth charge reverberated through bones and nerves. The psychological strain intensified patrol after patrol. In May 1943, the breaking point arrived. That month alone, more than 40 U-boats were lost. Entire wolfpacks vanished. Some were cornered by coordinated air and sea attacks. Others were detected by radar at night, a cruel reversal of earlier tactics when darkness had shielded them. Now the night belonged to the Allies. Submariners surfaced cautiously, if at all, aware that a radar-equipped aircraft could appear without warning. Dönitz faced an impossible reality. The Atlantic campaign, once Germany's sharpest blade, was dulling. He ordered temporary withdrawals from the North Atlantic shipping lanes, hoping to regroup and innovate. New technologies were rushed into development: improved torpedoes, acoustic homing devices, snorkels that allowed diesel engines to run while submerged. But innovation under pressure rarely catches up fast enough. By the time these upgrades reached operational boats, Allied countermeasures were already adapting. The arithmetic was unforgiving. In 1942, U-boats that sunk millions of tons of shipping. In 1943, despite continued effort, sinkings declined sharply while losses soared. The balance had flipped. Instead of strangling Allied supply lines, submarines were being systematically hunted. Individual stories reflected the broader collapse. Experienced commanders who had once returned to port, decorated and celebrated, now failed to come back at all. Ports in occupied France grew quieter. Wives and families received telegrams bearing stark news. The Atlantic swallowed boats without trace, leaving only oil slicks and drifting debris. Allied crews, once fearful and reactive, grew confident. Escort groups developed aggressive hunter-killer tactics. Rather than merely defending convoys, they actively pursued submarine contacts. If sonar detected a submerged U-boat, ships would maintain contact for hours, sometimes days, executing coordinated depth charge patterns. Patience replaced panic. Submarines that once slipped away now found themselves pinned beneath relentless assault. Technology compounded the pressure. The introduction of improved sonar and head-throwing weapons such as hedgehog mortars increased kill probabilities dramatically. Instead of dropping charges blindly behind a ship, escorts could project explosives forward into a submarine's path. If detonations followed, confirmation was immediate. The era of uncertain outcomes was fading. Even when submarines managed successful attacks, the strategic impact diminished. Allied shipyards replaced losses at a staggering rate. Tankers, freighters, troop transports, hull after hull emerged from American docks. The United States had embraced industrial warfare fully. Its output was not merely sustaining Britain, it was building the foundation for massive offensives in North Africa, Italy, and eventually Normandy. Supplies crossed the Atlantic in such volume that even successful sinkings barely slowed momentum. German submariners sensed the futility. Patrol reports grew shorter, encounters were briefer and more desperate. The old confident tone of second happy time logs gave way to sober assessments. Fuel shortages, limited training, replacement crews lacked the experience of earlier veterans. Meanwhile, Allied air superiority expanded relentlessly. Long-range bombers such as the B-24 Liberator closed the final gaps in Atlantic coverage, leaving virtually no sanctuary. When preparations for D-Day intensified in 1944, the Atlantic was no longer contested in Germany's favor. It was controlled. Massive convoys carrying troops and equipment assembled openly. U-boats attempted interference, but few penetrated defensive screens. Many were intercepted before reaching firing position. The ocean that had once carried flames along America's shores now carried an invasion force toward Europe. Dönitz never fully abandoned his belief in submarine warfare. He hoped that advanced designs like the Type 21 electroboat, capable of greater submerged speed and endurance, might restore initiative. But these revolutionary vessels arrived too late and in too few numbers to alter the outcome. By the time they entered limited service, Allied armies were advancing on German soil. The human cost of the campaign was staggering. Of roughly 40,000 German submariners who served during the war, more than 30,000 perished. The casualty rate was among the highest of any branch in the conflict. Boats that once sailed amid laughter and confidence vanished silently beneath gray swells. The Atlantic did not return bodies, it kept them. For the United States Navy, the transformation was equally profound. From the vulnerability of early 1942 to the coordinated dominance of 1944, it had evolved at breathtaking speed. Lessons were absorbed. Industry surged. Innovation spread from shipyards to sonar rooms to flight decks. What U-boat crews once dismissed as weakness proved instead to be adaptation in progress. In the end, the Atlantic became not the lifeline Germany sought to sever, but the highway that ensured its defeat. Supplies flowed uninterrupted. Troops crossed safely. The arsenal of democracy delivered its output in endless waves. Beneath those same waters lay the steel hulls of submarines that once ruled with confidence. The mockery of early victories faded into memory. The hunters who believed the ocean belonged to them discovered that oceans favor no one for long. Power at sea is not static. It belongs to those who can build, learn, and endure faster than their enemy. What began as a shooting gallery ended as a graveyard. And in the cold depths of the Atlantic, the echoes of that reversal remain, a reminder that in total war, arrogance can sink as surely as steel.